All right. Well, thank you guys for coming and braving the cold weather. But this is just, I don't know if I want to use the word warming you up. It's preparing you for next week. And then you can get out when it's good and cold. When this will seem like a heat wave. Right now, I know it's a long ways off, but I think WeatherBug's predicting -1 for the low next Wednesday. So that'll be a bit chillier than tonight. So tonight we are going to be in the book of Kings, continue on with that, and we're going to be talking about Solomon building the temple. And last time we met, before the Snowmageddon, that really didn't come, but anyway, before Snowmageddon we talked about David preparing for the building of the temple, him, anointing Solomon as king and preparing that stuff, but David not being able to build the temple himself. And that's what we're going to be picking up with tonight and kind of continuing on with that theme. And we're going to talk about the temple actually being built and then being dedicated. The book that we're kind of following, we're going to do just chapters 5 and 6. The prayers and stuff for the dedication of the temple are in chapter 8. So if you are done with your daily reading for your 180-day Bible and you go, gosh, I just wished I could read 66 more verses tonight. Read chapter 8 because that is kind of the continuation of what we're doing tonight. Chapter 7 is the building of Solomon's palace. So we're going to do 5 and 6, talking about the temple. 7 would be the palace. 8 is the dedication of the temple. So, like I said, when you're sitting there and you get done with your 180-day or whatever reading plan and go, I just need 66 more verses. That would be perfect to top this all off. Then chapter 8's the chapter for you. All right. So we're going to be in, like I said, 1 Kings chapter 5 is where we're going to be kicking off and talking about the building of it. So one of the things that I don't know whether to wait and talk about it when we get into it. I think I'll just go ahead and talk about it now and kind of lead into it, and we'll talk about it then as well. But one of the things when Israel was calling for a king, and Samuel said, but these are the things that are going to happen. Now, understand, Solomon is a good king at this point. He gets a little astray with some of his stuff that later on, but right now Solomon is kind of at the top of his game as far as being honoring to God. He's only 4 years into his reign. Things are going very well. But he, in a mild way, steps into exactly what Samuel warned them about. And that is, if you have a king, he is going to basically conscript people from Israel and trade them for labor and goods. And that starts with this. Now later we see even more so, but just the door is opened at this time for that. And we're going to see that in these first verses here. It says, when Hiram, king of Tyre, heard that Solomon had been anointed king to succeed his father David, he sent his envoys to Solomon because he had always been on friendly terms with David. So we're talking Tyre and Sidon and stuff, the area of Lebanon. So just to the north of them. And the king sends down his envoys and says, hey, congratulations, Solomon. Here you're the king now. Your dad and I always got along. There's no reason we can't get along. And so it says, Solomon sent back this message to Hiram. You know that because of the wars waged against my father David from all sides, that he could not build a temple for the name of the Lord, his God, until the Lord put his enemies under his feet. David was a warrior. And God said, because of the bloodshed, because of the things that you've done, you will not be the one to build your temple, but instead your son will. And so Solomon's laying that out for King Hiram here. He says, but the Lord my God has given me rest on every side, and there is no adversary or disaster. I intend, therefore, to build a temple for the name of the Lord my God, as the Lord told my father David when he said, your son, whom I put in the throne in your place, will build the temple for my name. So this is a fulfillment of what God told David. You're not going to build me a temple. You can get the stuff together, but you're not doing it. Your son, who is going to sit on the throne after you, he will live in a time of peace. He's the one who's going to build my temple. And so that's what we have, is Solomon then being the one to build. And it says, so give orders. Now here's where we go into this. You ready? Give orders that cedars of Lebanon be cut for me. My men will work with yours, and I will pay for your men whatever wages you set. You know that we have no one so skilled in felling. Sent word to Solomon, I have received the message you sent me, and will do all you want in providing the cedar and juniper logs. My men will haul them down from Lebanon to the Mediterranean Sea, and I will float them as rafts by sea to the place you specify. There I will separate them, and you can take them away. And you are to grant my wish by providing food for my royal household. In this way, Hiram kept Solomon supplied with all the cedar and juniper logs that he wanted, and Solomon gave Hiram 20,000 cores of wheat and food for his household. So tons, like 3,600 tons of grain and oil, olive oil and stuff like that for his household. And then additions to 20,000 baths of pressed olive oil. So Solomon works out this deal. He says, I'm going to build this temple, but I need a lot of cedar. I need a lot of cedar. And where do you get cedar? From Lebanon. It's even known today, the cedars of Lebanon. You know, you've heard that term. And literally, Lebanon is full of cedar trees. And so the king up there says, you know, we got plenty of cedar. And Solomon goes, I need a lot of cedar. I'm building the temple. I'm building my palace later. I'm going to need a lot of cedar, and I'm going to need a lot of juniper. And so the king goes, perfect. And so Solomon says, get it for me. I'll provide whatever you want. He says, great. I got men that's what they do, is timber and logging. We'll cut them down. We'll drag them down to the Mediterranean Sea, kind of in the north there of Lebanon. We'll lash them together like rafts, and we'll just float them down the Mediterranean. I mean, makes sense, right? Why haul them over land? You can just tie them together and kind of keep eye on them and bring them right down the sea. So that's what they do. They bring them down so that they can get them at the port, which is straight across basically from Jerusalem, and they just haul them up over the hill, and there they go. So, makes perfect sense. Then Solomon continued to do this for Hiram year after year. That's giving him the food and stuff. The Lord gave Solomon wisdom just as he had promised him. There were peaceful relations between Hiram and Solomon, and the two of them made a treaty. Here we go. You ready? King Solomon conscripted laborers from all Israel, 30,000 men. He sent them off to Lebanon in shifts of 10,000 a month, so that they spent 1 month in Lebanon and 2 months at home. So he says, if we're going to do this, I've got to have labor to do that. So these 30,000 men are now working for me. Well, that's exactly what Samuel said the king would do if they had a king, is he will say, I need to conscript this labor so that you're now working for me, and put a burden on the people. And that was just the very beginning of it. And so this is still being done on the premise of building the temple and stuff. So it's not that he is out of control or anything, but it's just that first putting his toes on that slippery slope. And then from there, Solomon, in order to build this kingdom that he has to have labor and he has to have taxes. It's the way it works. As Solomon's like, I'm going to build this big temple. I'm not saying anything's wrong here. I'm just saying it's that watch the progression. I'm not saying anything's wrong here. I'm just saying it's that watch the progression as you look at the life of Solomon. Then it says, Adoniram was in charge of the forced labor. Solomon had 70,000 carriers and 80,000 stone cutters in the hills, as well as 3,300 foremen who supervised the project and directed the workers. This was quite the engineering project to build this temple. At the king's command, they removed from the quarry large blocks of high-grade stone to provide a foundation for the dress stone for the temple. The craftsmen of Solomon and Hiram and workers from Byblos cut and prepared the timber and stone for the building of the temple. Now, Byblos is in Lebanon, where it would be, is in modern day. A little further up the coast from Tyre and Sidon. But again, skilled workers who worked with trees, worked with lumber, worked with that kind of stuff. And so they were ones that were brought in, as well as the people of Israel and the people of Lebanon to get all of this material and to cut all this stone. And as we get into the next part, we're going to see the dimensions of the temple. We're going to see kind of how it was to be built, how they did it, how they gathered these materials and stuff. But first, I'm going to show you a little video. And I did not come up with this video. My daughter did. And she said, I'm going to show this to the high schoolers and the junior hires. And I went, well, that's kind of a cool little video. Now, please understand, this is an artist's rendition of what he thought the temple looked like. So there are a few things that you look at and go, that doesn't seem exactly like I read it. But it's his interpretation of it. And so understand that. The other thing is when we've been talking, on Sunday morning and stuff because of the book of Hebrews about the tabernacle, now we're going to be talking, or going to see the pictures of the temple. And the temple of Solomon is supersized, according to what and some of the areas of the Old Testament, stuff like that. One of the big things is in the tabernacle they had a menorah, one menorah, 7-branch candelabra that they had there in the holy place, outside the Holy of Holies, that they had to keep burning. When Solomon built his temple, he had 10, 5 on each side to illuminate the whole room. Okay? So little things like that. It does depict that well. But there's some other things that you might go, is that exactly the way that was described? And, just take it with a grain of salt. It's an interpretation, but it's still kind of a fun little video to watch. So we will watch this, and then we'll go on to chapter 6. again, just kind of a visual representation to kind of get your mind thinking that direction. Is it snapshots of the actual temple? No, we don't have any of those. So that's about as close as we're going to get, is just what we can, take out of the scripture, and then artists do a rendition. Now, there are other places in the Old Testament where it talks about the furnishings of the temple and the temple itself, and so this artist has taken them from different sources. So you won't hear everything that's there tonight, but you get kind of a general picture of it. The other thing we're going to talk about, the size of the temple versus the size of the tabernacle. And so it says, in the 480th year after the Israelites came out of Egypt, in the 4th year of Solomon's reign over Israel, in the month of Ziv, the 2nd month, he began to build the temple of the Lord. So things have been acquired, things have been set there, they're ready to start building, and that 2nd month, they begin construction. It says, the temple that King Solomon built for the Lord was 60 cubits long, 20 wide, and 30 high. Now, let's kind of put that into perspective. The tabernacle we talked about on Sunday morning was basically from the back wall back there, forgot to turn the cross on, that back wall, to somewhere up here, front row, maybe the 2nd row at the most, about 15 feet or so. And this sanctuary is just a little more than 30 feet wide, and so that was the holy place in the tabernacle, basically just a little bit bigger than the stage up here. 20 cubits wide makes the holy place here about the width of this. It's almost 30 feet. So we have the width of this, and 60 cubits long is about 90 feet, which is essentially the length of the entire building. Actually, it would be just a little bit more. Add the air conditioner on the outside. And that would be about 90 feet. So we went from the stage to this whole building, and substantially higher. 17 feet to the peak of the roof back there, and this would be 30 cubits, so yeah, you're talking bigger. 45 feet, something like that high inside that first chamber. And so that's the main room of that. Then it says, the portico at the front of the main hall of the temple extended the width of the temple, that is 20 cubits, and projected 10 cubits from the front of the temple. He made narrow windows high up in the temple walls. Against the walls of the main hall and inner sanctuary, he built a structure around the building, in which there were side rooms. The lowest floor was 5 cubits wide, the middle floor 6 cubits, and the third floor 7. He made offset ledges around the outside of the temple so that nothing would be inserted into the temple walls. In building the temple, only blocks dressed at the quarry were used, and no hammer, chisel, or any other iron tool was heard at the temple site while it was being built. Now, imagine that, okay? You're building this temple, and the people who are quarrying all this stone, and the people that are preparing all these logs and stuff, they have to do them off-site, and they have to fit. Because you can't knock the edges off when you're up on the Temple Mount, because there was no iron tools heard anywhere on the Temple Mount. So the precision that it would have taken for these craftsmen to quarry those stones to get the exact dimensions and to get them sit perfectly one on top of the other and beside each other, think of that dimensionally without any CAD drawings or any of the modern tools that we rely on now. Yet they were able to accomplish this and build it all essentially off-site and bring it and just set it up on the Temple Mount. The entrance to the lowest floor was on the south side of the temple. A stairway led up to the middle level, and from there to the third. So he built the temple and completed it, roofing it with beams and cedar planks. And he built the side rooms all along the temple. The height of each was 5 cubits. And they were attached to the temple by beams of cedar. The word of the Lord came to Solomon. As for this temple you are building, if you follow my decrees, observe my laws, and keep all of my commands and obey them, I will fulfill through you the promise I gave to David your father. And I will live among the Israelites and will not abandon my people Israel. And so we go back to, again, what he had told David. And that is, as long as your descendants continue to obey me like you have. And you might go, wait a minute, David screwed up a few times in there. I don't know if I'd call that obey, but he did. He still had that heart for God. He still obeyed his commands. Yes, he had his failures. Yes, he had his problems with it, but he still had that heart for God. And he was telling him that if your sons and their sons after them will continue to obey, I will be their God and I'll dwell here. Now, we know, and they knew, God can't be contained inside of a building. God can't be contained, period. But what God was saying is, I will put a visual reminder right here in the face of the people. I will be here. And they know that I am their God, and I will dwell amongst you. And it seems so simple to us, especially if you have God living just up the hill. Obey, and look at all the blessings we're going to have. Disobey, and look at the consequences. But yet, much like us, they had a different plan. I'd better do it my own way. And so kings were led off by their own ego, by their own greed, by their own whatever, their, lust for power, and they started to fall away and disobey God. And that's the thing that David did not do. And Solomon, in all of his wisdom, really didn't pursue the wealth. He became very wealthy because God promised he would bless him with that. But that wasn't Solomon's main goal. He didn't do everything, chasing that. As a matter of fact, later in his life, when he's writing, he's saying, all this is meaningless. All this is junk. Doesn't matter. I mean, here's the richest man ever, and he's got storerooms full of gold and silver and everything else you can imagine. And he says, it's not worth anything. It's meaningless. It's worthless. And he recognizes that it's the pursuit of God that he needed. And it's that relationship with God. But after Solomon, starting with his son, things really go bad. Because the kings lose sight of who God is. To the point where, you get a ways into the Old Testament, start reading the history of Israel, and you get to some of the good kings, and they have to reintroduce the law to them. And they have to reintroduce the writings of some of the prophets to them. And they have to reintroduce what God said to Israel, because they completely lost track of it. And they were living their own way. And you have things like kings setting up altars to foreign gods in the temple. What's that one to me is like, what a slap in the face. Not only are you not sticking to your end of the deal, recognizing God as your God, but now you're walking into the house that was built for him and placing other idols in there. Oh, here's an idol space that I can use. We'll set these up. And they did. And so you wonder, how God was patient and tolerant with Israel as much as he was. Really. We can talk about how mean the God of the Old Testament was sometimes, or how strict he was and blah, blah, blah. But, man, read the Old Testament and look at God's patience and kindness and his love and his mercy. If God would have been the ruthless God that people make him out to be, he'd have wiped them out right after Solomon. He would have said, you ain't worth it. And just, because they go through so many cycles of that. But he says, just like you promised David, if we're faithful to you, you will always keep his descendant on the throne. And Solomon is counting on that. And like I said, if you go and read chapter 8, and we were going to read it tonight, but it's so long, I just didn't think we would be able to get through it. But if you go and read 8, you'll see his prayers. And in the prayers, it's remarkable because Solomon's like, God, I know you've promised Father David, that if we are faithful to you and we do this and we do this, then you're going to keep, David's descendant on the throne forever, and you're going to bless us and you're going to honor us and you're going to dwell amongst us and all that. And when we don't, it's basically when we're led away because of our unfaithfulness, then please hear our cries as we beg for your mercy. And please hear the cries of the people who turn back to you and repent of their sinful ways and turn from their wicked ways and turn with their whole heart back to you. Hear their prayers and their cries. And, that's just such a profound thing, the wisdom of Solomon there, is he saw it coming. He's like, man, this will be great. If we just do all you ask us to do, it's going to be perfect. So when we don't, please take us back again. Because it ain't going to happen. I know us. It ain't going to happen. And like I said, God's mercy throughout the Old Testament, and then his mercy even shown even greater when he sends Christ to be the sacrifice for all of us. And not only opens it up to the people that he chose, but to all mankind, to have that relationship with Jesus and to have that forgiveness and that mercy. It says, so Solomon built the temple and completed it. He lined its interior walls with cedar boards, paneling them from the floor of the temple to the ceiling. So why did he need so much cedar? That's a lot of cedar. Floor to ceiling, paneling. And covered the floor of the temple with planks of juniper. He partitioned off 20 cubits at the rear of the temple with cedar boards, from floor to ceiling, to form within the temple an inner sanctuary, the most holy place. Now, the difference, again, between the tabernacle and the temple is the tabernacle was kind of an extension off of the main Holy of Holies. It was the same width, it was just half as deep. And so it was just like, cut into 3 sections, and a third of it was the Holy of Holies, and 2/3 of it was the holy place. Here, he takes a section within that and partitions it off and says, this is where the Holy of Holies is going to be. And so it says, the main hall in front of this room was 40 cubits long. The inside of the temple was cedar, carved with gourds and open flowers. Everything was cedar. No stone was to be seen. So from the outside, it's all dressed stone. From the inside, it's all cedar. Must have smelled awesome. That's a heck of a cedar closet, right? Then it says, he prepared the inner sanctuary within the temple to set the Ark of the Covenant of the Lord there. The inner sanctuary was 20 cubits long, 20 wide, and 20 high. He overlaid the inside with pure gold, and he also overlaid the altar of cedar. Solomon covered the inside of the temple with pure gold. And he extended gold chains across the front of the inner sanctuary, which was overlaid with gold. So he overlaid the whole interior with gold. He also overlaid with gold the altar that belonged to the inner sanctuary. Now, you are impressed with all the cedar? What about all the gold? To overlay all of that, to make it pure gold. And that's what they kind of depicted in there. If you notice, when you walk into that holy place, everything was gold, with the lamps kind of gleaming off of it. I imagine that it would have been just breathtaking. Also, one of the main reasons why when they destroyed the temple, they did it with fire, because that would melt that all down and then you could collect it. And so that's a lot of gold. For the inner sanctuary, he made a pair of cherubim out of olive wood, each 10 cubits high. One wing of the first cherub was 5 cubits long, and the other wing 5 cubits, 10 cubits from wingtip to wingtip. The second cherub was also measured 10 cubits, for the 2 cherubim were identical in size and shape. The height of each cherub was 10 cubits. He placed the cherubim inside the innermost room of the temple with their wings spread out, the wings of one cherub touching one wall, while the wing of the other touched the other wall, and their wings touched each other in the middle of the room. So that was depicted in the picture we saw. I guess for my own brain, reading this and interpreting this, I wouldn't have made them quite so Egyptian. Okay? Just me, but they looked a little too, a lot of the imagery in the temple, I know that Moses would have had influence from the Egyptians, but Solomon would not have in that same respect. But there's kind of a theory that the temple that Solomon built was based upon other temples that were existing in the area. Basically, that he copied some of the architecture of the Egyptians and of the Assyrians and of whatever, and the Hittites. And so his temple was a mimicking kind of what you see in some of those big complexes. I don't believe that to be true. What I see in Scripture is God gave him the dimensions, God gave him the layout. God said, this is the way I want this temple built. And I'm thinking God is more imaginative than even the Egyptians. So I think that's probably where that influence really comes from. There seemed to be a lot of it, especially in the cherubim. They were, it doesn't say they were four-legged creatures with the body of an animal and the Egyptian headdress on. But artist interpretation, like I said, don't overthink it. Take it with a grain of salt. Move on. What we do know, two large figures, 10 cubits high each, so about 15 feet high or so. Wingspan of each was 10 cubits. And so when you put the two side by side, one wing touched that wall, they touched in the middle, and another wing touched that wall. And so the entire thing of it was spread out with these large winged creatures overshadowing the Ark of the Covenant, where it sat there before this. And there was an altar there to sprinkle the blood on the Day of Atonement. Then it says he overlaid the cherubim with gold on the walls all around the temple. In both the inner and outer rooms, he carved cherubim, palm trees, and open flowers. He also covered the floors of both the inner and outer rooms of the temple with gold. For the entrance to the inner sanctuary, he made doors out of olive wood that were 1/5 of the width of the sanctuary. And on the two olive wood doors, he carved cherubim, palm trees, and open flowers, and overlaid these cherubim and palm trees with hammered gold. That's a lot of gold. And a lot of carving, and a lot of wood, and a lot of everything. So you can see the opulence of what this was, and the splendor that Solomon was able to give to this temple. When you read this description, it explains why later, after the Babylonian captivity, when they come back and attempt to rebuild the temple, the people who could remember Solomon's temple before it was destroyed by the Babylonians saw the new temple and wept. They were like, are you kidding me? That's our temple. We left the most splendid thing I've ever seen in my life, and now we're looking at a shed, comparatively. But that's what they had the resources to rebuild. They didn't have the silver, they didn't have the gold, they didn't have the cedar. They had the stones that were left to rebuild what they could rebuild so that they could worship then again. The time of peace and all the treaties that Solomon had made, all the things that he had collected, all the things that people had, made this just an incredible spectacle. And I can't even fathom in my brain what this really would have looked like. I don't think an artist can really capture what it would have been, like I said before, to come over the Mount of Olives and to stand there and look into that set of valleys, but to look in there and see that temple standing there, and how awe-inspiring it must have been. And that's what Solomon wanted. He wanted people to come to Jerusalem and be in awe of God. If this is his house, think of what kind of a God he must be. And no matter what anybody says, if this is an accurate description, which I believe it was, no other temple had that kind of opulence. None of them did. This is a step above everything else they've found archaeologically. And it was to glorify the one true God. It says in the same way, For the entrance to the main hall, he made door frames out of olive wood that were 1/4 of the width of the hall. He also made 2 doors out of juniper wood, each having 2 leaves that turned in the sockets. He carved cherubim, palm branches, and open flowers on them, and overlaid them with gold hammered evenly over the carvings. And the way they used to make the doors, you can actually go back to Israel today and still see evidence of things from about that time period, is they would literally, on the floor of stone, is they would carve out holes, basically, where they would have the posts that would go down into that, and that's what they would hinge on. And mount the hinges on the side. They would be on pivots, basically, and they could open those large doors for the synagogues and for things like the temple and stuff like that. And it says he built the inner courtyard of 3 courses of dressed stone and 1 course of trimmed cedar beams. The foundation of the temple of the Lord was laid in the 4th year in the month of Ziv. In the 11th year, in the month of Bul, the 8th month, the temple was finished in all its details according to its specifications. He had spent 7 years building it. So 7 years to build the temple. 4 years to get things all ready after Dad anointed him king. 4 years into his reign, he was ready to start building, and then it took 7 years to build this temple. Now that seems like it's pretty incredible. King Herod spent 40 years rebuilding the temple and didn't finish it before he died. So that kind of gives you an idea of what Herod thought, and the scale of what Herod did with it. But if you figure all the men that he listed, all the inscripted labor that he had and everything, and it still took 7 years to construct this temple, you can kind of see that, number one, the craftsmanship and the quality that they did this. Also the fact that they didn't build it on site, essentially. They built it off site, brought the dimensions, cut the stones, cut the timber and stuff, brought it there, and it fit. Incredibly skilled craftsmen. Also, I think a little help from the Holy Spirit. I think God went, take a little bit more off that one. Yeah, that'll be better. But just to be able to build something like that. And again, it was a monument to God. And it was to show the world how awesome God was. And God gave them the promises. You know, if you obey me and you follow me, this won't end. But as we know from history, they didn't. And now, it's gone. Oh, these are all conditional. Yes, well, the original covenant with Abraham, he did by himself. I will make you a great nation, and he did. He made him a great nation. These, and gave him the land. These were conditional ones. If you continue to do this, this is just a taste of what we got to come. And, you know, there's the irony of it is you could see how well he blessed David and Solomon, and you'd think that some of the kings coming after them, being their descendants, would have went, you know, if he's done this for them, how well would it go for me if we continued to worship God? But yet, like I said, their own egos and greed and everything else got in the way, and they weren't able to continue doing that. But yeah, so, all right. Well, let's say goodbye to our friends at home.